When Daniel Harrow received the letter, he almost tore it up without reading. It was written in sharp, neat handwriting on yellowed stationery and signed by a name he hadn't spoken in years, his late grandfather, Elias Harrow. The man had been dead for over a decade. But the letter was real, and inside it was a deed. Daniel had inherited the Harrow family estate, a sprawling manor house on the edge of a forgotten town in Massachusetts. He had no desire to return. His childhood memories of the place were soaked in fear. Dark hallways, locked rooms, whispers behind closed doors. His mother had run away from it when she was still a teenager, refusing to speak of the Harrows ever again. And yet, here it was, his name on the deed, his signature required. The first night Daniel returned to the manor, it felt less like a homecoming and more like a trap. The air smelled faintly of smoke, though the fireplaces hadn't been lit in years. The wallpaper peeled like shedding skin, and the grand portraits of long-dead Harrows stared down at him with cold, painted eyes. One portrait in particular made him pause. His grandfather, Elias, standing tall, a stern figure with a pocket watch dangling from his hand. Daniel remembered that watch. He remembered the sound of its ticking at night, echoing through the hallways long after his grandfather had died. That night, as he unpacked his things in the bedroom, he heard it again. Tick, tick, tick. Daniel froze. The sound was coming from the dresser drawer. He opened it slowly, his breath catching. Inside, resting neatly on a folded handkerchief, was his grandfather's pocket watch. Its hands spun wildly, ticking faster and faster, though no one had wound it in years. And as Daniel stared, words etched themselves into the tarnished silver surface. Letter by letter, like an invisible hand was carving them. Welcome back, Daniel. It begins with you. Daniel barely slept that night. Every time he closed his eyes, he swore he could hear the pocket watch ticking somewhere in the room, even though he had buried it at the bottom of his suitcase. At dawn, he wandered the halls of the Harrow estate, sunlight slanting through dusty curtains. The portraits followed him with their painted eyes, each ancestor wearing the same grim expression, the same sharp cheekbones and hollow gaze. He paused before one portrait, his great-grandmother, Margaret Harrow. Unlike the others, her eyes weren't cold. They looked terrified, as though she knew some dreadful secret. At the bottom of the frame, written in fading paint, was a single phrase: "The curse spares no heir." Daniel felt his stomach knot. Later that morning, he found the library. It smelled of mildew and old paper, its shelves sagging beneath the weight of centuries. As he ran his fingers along the spines, he found a leather-bound book marked only with the Harrow crest. Inside were generations of records, births, deaths, marriages, all carefully written in the same hand. But as he turned the pages, his pulse quickened. Every name had a note beside it. Not just dates of death, but causes. And the causes were always the same. Taken by the house, claimed by the blood, swallowed by the curse. His breath caught when he reached the final entry. Daniel Harrow, 1992, ? And beneath it, a line already written in ink too fresh to have been there for long. To be claimed. The room chilled. The pages of the book rustled, though there was no wind. And then he heard it, his grandfather's voice, deep and gravelly, whispering just behind his ear. "The Harrows never die in peace, Daniel. Neither will you." Daniel spun around, but the library was empty. The book
lay open in his hands, the ink still glistening.
That night, the house did not sleep. Daniel sat in bed, the pocket watch lying on the dresser across the room. He hadn't touched it since the words had burned into its silver surface, yet the ticking grew louder every hour, like a heartbeat that wasn't his own. Tick, tick, tick. At midnight, the sound stopped. And that was worse. The silence was so heavy it pressed against his chest. He rose, pulling a blanket around his shoulders, and opened the bedroom door. The hallway stretched ahead, long and dim, lined with portraits. The air smelled faintly of smoke and iron. At first, nothing moved. Then, from the far end of the corridor, a shadow shifted. Daniel froze. It looked like a man, tall, shoulders squared, a pocket watch dangling from one hand. The dim light caught the glint of its silver surface. "Grandfather," Daniel whispered before he could stop himself. The figure did not move. It simply stood there, watching. Daniel's throat went dry. He stepped forward, heart hammering, but the closer he drew, the darker the figure became, until it was nothing but a silhouette with burning eyes. The portraits on the walls seemed to lean toward him, their painted mouths twisting, their whispers slithering into his ears. "The curse spares no heir. It takes what it is owed. Run, Daniel, run." He turned, panic clawing at his chest, but the hallway behind him had stretched impossibly long, the doorway to his bedroom lost in endless shadow. The figure at the end began to walk toward him, slow, measured. The steady swing of the pocket watch echoed with every step. Daniel stumbled backward until his hand struck a door on his left. Without thinking, he shoved it open and fell inside. The room was pitch black. The door slammed shut behind him. And then the ticking started again. Inside the room, right beside his ear. The sound of the ticking filled the dark room, sharp and relentless, echoing like nails against glass. Daniel fumbled for the light switch, but his fingers found only cold stone. His panic deepened. This wasn't a bedroom. It was a staircase. Narrow steps stretched downward into a damp, suffocating black. The air stank of earth and mold, the scent of something long buried. And beneath the ticking, Daniel thought he heard whispers, low, guttural voices chanting in unison, too distant to understand. Against his every instinct, he descended. Each step groaned under his weight, as though the house itself resisted his intrusion. The walls wept moisture, and his breath hung in the air like smoke. At the bottom, his flashlight beam cut across a heavy door of iron and wood. Rust ate at its hinges, but carved deep into its surface was the Harrow crest, a snarling wolf devouring its own tail. Beneath it, in faded script, were words he could barely read. "Blood for blood, the curse for the heir." His hand shook as he pushed the door open. Inside stretched a crypt. Stone coffins lined the walls, each marked with the names of his ancestors. Candles, impossibly still burning, cast flickering shadows across their lids. And in the center of the tomb stood a single coffin larger than the rest. Elias Harrow. Daniel's chest constricted. The coffin lid was half open, and within lay not the shriveled body of his grandfather, but something far worse. It looked like Elias, but his skin was gray and stretched, his lips drawn back in a grin that revealed blackened teeth. His hands were folded over the pocket watch, its ticking louder than ever, reverberating through the stone chamber. As Daniel staggered closer, Elias's eyes snapped open. They glowed faintly like embers deep in a dying fire. And with a voice that seemed to rise from every coffin in the crypt, his grandfather whispered, "It is your turn, Daniel. The Harrows must feed the house." The coffins around him began to shake.
Lids rattled, stone grinding against stone. From the cracks, pale fingers curled outward, reaching for him. Daniel ran, but the ticking followed. Always the ticking. Daniel didn't remember how he made it back to the main floor. The staircase twisted, the walls seemed to close in, but somehow he burst into the hallway, gasping for breath, his hands stained with dust from the crypt. The portraits stared down at him as though mocking his escape. Their eyes, once lifeless paint, now glistened with a wet, glassy sheen. He swore he saw their mouths twitch, lips curling in cruel smiles. The ticking grew louder. It was no longer coming from the pocket watch alone. It pulsed through the entire house, in the floorboards, in the walls, in his chest. Daniel stumbled into the parlor, where the fire roared though he had never lit it. Above the mantel hung another portrait of Elias Harrow, this one larger than the rest. But something was different now. Elias's painted hand no longer held the pocket watch. The chain hung empty, broken. Daniel looked down. The watch was in his own hand. He hadn't picked it up, hadn't touched it since the crypt, yet here it was, its face cracked, its hands spinning furiously. The whispers returned, louder this time. They filled the room, crawling under his skin, pressing into his mind until he could hardly breathe. The curse spares no heir. You are the blood, you are the vessel. To break it, you must feed it. Daniel dropped the watch onto the floor. The glass shattered, but instead of silence, a scream erupted from it. High-pitched, endless, rattling the windows. The flames in the fireplace surged, and in them Daniel saw shapes, figures writhing, twisted bodies with familiar faces. His ancestors, bound in fire, their mouths open in silent agony. And among them, his mother. "No," Daniel whispered, stumbling backward. "No, she escaped. She left this place. But the vision burned clear. His mother's eyes turned toward him, filled with sorrow. She raised a hand toward him as though pleading for release. The voice of Elias thundered through the fire, through the walls, through Daniel's very bones. "You cannot escape the blood, Daniel. One must be sacrificed. The curse does not end, it only chooses." The fire roared higher. The pocket watch, cracked and broken, ticked one last time, slow, deliberate, final. Tick, tick, tick. Daniel backed away from the fireplace, his face pale in the glow of the flames. His ancestors' screams echoed in his skull, his mother's sorrowful gaze burning into him. The weight of every Harrow before him pressed down, suffocating. The whispers rose into a single demand. Blood for blood, the curse for the heir. The house shook violently, dust raining from the ceiling. The portraits rattled on the walls, their painted mouths stretching wide, bearing rows of teeth. The floorboards cracked, and from the gaps, blackened hands clawed upward, reaching for Daniel's legs. He seized the broken pocket watch from the floor, gripping it so tightly the sharp metal edges cut into his palm. Blood dripped onto the shattered glass, and the watch responded. Its fractured face glowed red, the hands spinning backward. The whispers grew frantic. It chooses now. Daniel realized the truth. The curse did not simply claim, it demanded a successor. It was bound to the bloodline, feeding on one Harrow after another, century after century, and now it was his turn to decide. But as the flames writhed and the house moaned around him, another thought clawed its way into his mind. What if the curse could be broken? The portraits screamed in unison, their painted eyes bleeding. Elias's voice roared above them all. "Sacrifice Daniel, or join us in eternal fire." His mother's face flickered again in the flames, pleading, not for her freedom, but for his. Daniel raised the pocket watch high, the whispers hissed, the walls shook, the fire howled, and then, with a cry that tore his throat raw, he hurled the watch into the heart of the fire. The world exploded in light. The screams cut off. The ticking stopped. For the first time since he had entered the Harrow estate, silence fell. Daniel opened his eyes slowly. The house was gone. He stood in the ruins of the estate, the walls collapsed into charred rubble, the portraits burned to ash. The crypt had caved in, the coffins buried beneath stone and soil. And yet, something wasn't right. He looked down at his hands. The skin was pale, his veins black. His reflection, caught in a shard of broken glass at his feet, showed eyes glowing faintly like embers. The curse had not been destroyed. It had chosen its new vessel. Daniel Harrow, the final heir.